Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is a webinar that's casting over a wide number of time zones, even amongst the speakers. We're on a wide number of time zones. My name is John Mancini. I'm Chief Evangelist with Infotechtion.com, and I'm joined by some really smart people today, which makes a webinar like this really fun. So what we're going to talk about is automated records management within the M365 platform. And what I would like to do is ask our two speakers to introduce themselves. Then I'll come back with a few just introductory comments, and then we'll get going. So Nick, why don't you go first? And then Vivek, why don't you give a little bit of introduction?
Great. Good morning, John. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Nick Robinson. I'm a program manager in the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Product Engineering team. And really excited to spend a little bit of time today talking about some of the capabilities we've recently brought to market in both information governance and records management. Looking forward to the discussion, and thanks for having me.
Vivek?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Really excited about this session to be speaking with John and Nick. My role is Chief Technology Officer at Infotechtion, and I'll be talking about some of the critical success factors, lessons learned, and how to evaluate Microsoft Records Management.
All righty, so why don't we get going? Next slide, Vivek. Just a quick word on who Infotechtion is. Infotechtion is a leading consultancy focused on info governance and focused on M365, O365 for some of those folks that are older in their branding. And they work very closely with Microsoft to help develop the platform. Their clients are mostly very large enterprises. So the things to keep in mind about Infotechtion, locations in Europe and in the United States, info governance experts, Microsoft 365 experts. And then the last thing, which really ties to what I want to kick off with, is they are pathfinders when it comes to thinking about these technologies in a new way. And so what I wanted to do is just tee up five inflection points, I think. Those of you that know me know that I've been doing this a long time. And it's a really interesting time in the evolution of the space and in the evolution of the entire Office 365 and SharePoint platform. And so the 5 points that I just wanted to touch on are based on some research that I've done with AIM, which is where I used to work, and did this a couple months ago. And I just wanted to tee these up to give you an idea of why you ought to think differently about this than perhaps you have in the past. And this first inflection point is one that I think really highlights the challenge that's ahead for organizations, is that there's a looming tide of content chaos in organizations. And so these two questions, I asked 500 leading information managers, and I said, okay, assume that the volume of information that you're managing now is X. What do you think it's going to be in 2 years? And the answer came back 4.5X, which is an immense change when you think about it. But the other point that is really important in that is I also asked them, what do you think the best guess would be for the percentage of unstructured information that's coming into your organization? And on average, the answer came back 57%. So those two combination of things point to the content chaos, rising tide in terms of volume, but also increasing complexity in terms of variety. Next slide, please. So this, we asked a whole variety of organizations, do you use Office 365 and or SharePoint in your organization? And this is the second inflection point, which is why organizations need to pay attention to this, why it's important, is that M365 is ubiquitous in organizations. So it is a factor that needs to be addressed as you think about your information governance practices. And more than that, given some of the changes in the platform, it can play maybe a little different role than perhaps you've thought of in the past. Next slide. I've been doing this a long time with AIM. And so I went back and found a question that I asked back in 2013 of from which repositories are you migrating content and documents into Office 365 and SharePoint Online. And the differences between 2019, when I asked this question most recently, and 2013, I think are really interesting in that it reflects the inflection point that is the change that's going on within the platform itself. So you see this rising tide of people that are interested in using this as a replacement for their file sync and share solution. That wouldn't have been the case 7 or 8 years ago. And they're also looking at this as a replacement for some of their traditional records management solutions. And they wouldn't have been thinking about that 6 or 7 years ago. Next slide. This question, when we asked, when people think about platform modernization, when they think about, they're going from here to here, and what is the here on this side? What are they trying to get into? And what you can clearly see is that organizations think about modernizing their platforms. They are looking to migrate on-prem content into Office 365. And so that is a big deal when you start to think about, okay, well, how do I marry that trend with the increased capabilities within M365? It's a potentially very potent marriage moving forward. Next slide. So this last one is, I think, pretty interesting to think about, just in the context of what's going on in the world right now. And you think about sort of the COVID-driven trends that are out there right now, and everybody driving towards remote work. And there's a data point that Microsoft has where they talk about the number of active users on Teams going from 31 million to 44 million to 75 million just in the course of like 6 weeks. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. And so for me, that inflection point is really interesting because it says two things. One is it says, it I think has people thinking about the benefits of a platform that has multifaceted content capabilities, because if you're connecting on remote work, odds are there's a document associated with that. Odds are there's a chat associated with that. Odds are there's presentations associated with that. And so you're luring people into kind of a holistic way of thinking about content, basically because they are looking for a tool that allows them to connect remotely. And that's, I think, really interesting. The second point I think that folks have to think about is that this explosion, if they're not careful, represents a real governance challenge downstream. And so if you can think about this on the front end, think about this before you've been using Teams for 2, 3, 4 years, and then all of a sudden come back and think, oh, golly, how am I going to govern this stuff? There's a unique opportunity right now for once in this industry to get ahead of a curve. And I think that's particularly exciting. So with that, let me turn this over to Nick Robinson. And Nick is going to guide us through some of the capabilities associated with the M365 platform, how records management is different than it was before. And Nick, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thanks so much, John. Yeah, and I'd just like to start out by echoing a little bit of what John has said around kind of the explosion in data and also the COVID impact. And so as we get into the kind of the talk and the format that I want to use today is to talk a little bit about kind of the customer challenges, the product set that we're bringing to market, and then some of the features that really build into our records management offer, as well as what we're doing next. But to start out, when we think about kind of the global pandemic that we're all wrestling with and the new realities of remote life, one of the things, in addition to what John said about the tremendous Teams growth, this has just been a huge cloud consumption driver across the board. And so I think Satya Nadella, our CEO at Microsoft, was recently quoted as saying, hey, we've seen 2 years of digital transformation take place in 2 months based on some of the impacts of this pandemic. So this is something that we're all in together, but we've seen kind of tremendous uptake. And when we think about that digital explosion, this is contributing to that as well. And so, as Satya says here on the slide, it's impacting every aspect of our daily lives and something that we're all kind of wrestling with and dealing with in a collective way across both our professional and our work lives as well as our personal lives. So I want to make sure to recognize and acknowledge that as we kind of work through this together. But then if we step forward onto the next slide and we look at how Microsoft has been investing in solutions to help our customers overcome some of these challenges, and specifically kind of a set of solutions around intelligent compliance and risk management. I just wanted to lay the context of kind of all the different areas that we're working in before we go deeply into information governance and records management. So quickly, when we think about the different areas of investment and what we've heard from customers that they need help with when they think about managing their digital estate and managing risk, we have kind of 4 big buckets of solutions that we've been delivering capabilities within. And so the first one is around information protection and governance. And this is where we'll spend quite a bit of time today, but this is really around protecting your sensitive data and then also governing that sensitive data and content that's critical to your business, wherever it is, whether it's in the Microsoft cloud or in some other applications as well. And we have ways to do that through connectors and other. And then the second piece is really around insider risk management. And what we've heard from customers and even our own, our CISO, our lead security officer here at Microsoft, is that, of course, there's always threats of attacks coming from outside the organization and risk of breach. But really, one of the things that really keeps leadership up at night is the risk of internal damage to the organization, whether inadvertent or malicious. Kind of we think about employees and people who have internal access to our own systems as actually being a huge risk. So we have a set of solutions about monitoring insider risk and understanding what activities might be taking place that are posing or creating additional risk for your organization, as well as communication compliance and enabling organizations to monitor communications across Teams, email, Skype for Business, and all the different modalities to ensure that, hey, one, are we within policy that we have within our organization? And two, are we meeting our regulatory requirements for monitoring communications for specific roles? And so some really great adoption stories that we've seen there as well. The third bucket is really around discovery and respond. So being able to find the content you need when you need it, whether it's to respond to a regulatory request, an investigation or a litigation, it could be a privacy request. And so this is where our e-discovery and our investigations capabilities fit, including our audit capability, which really underpins all of our solutions with that comprehensive audit log. And then finally, compliance management is an area we've been investing as well with the compliance manager and now the compliance score capability. And really what we want to do is help customers on their journey towards compliance in the Microsoft cloud and beyond. And so these are things where you can look at assessments for common regulations like GDPR. You can also bring in your own custom assessments, and you can understand the changes, the implementations that you make in your Microsoft services and how they impact your journey towards compliance with those regulations. And so this really gives you a dial on taking advantage of all the services and solutions that you have in Microsoft 365 to be more prepared and positioned for compliance vis-a-vis those regulations. So I just wanted to set that context as we go deeply into the first pillar with information protection and governance around the different things that we've been working on delivering for customers. So I think we can go to the next slide and kind of dig into the information protection and governance pillar specifically a little bit more deeply. So to break this down, there's a lot here. And there's a few things that we'll look at more closely as we go through the discussion. But first off, we want to help customers understand where their sensitive data is. And so we have a new data classification dashboard that we'll look at a little bit later that's really around knowing your data. We actually had a great customer, one of our design partners said to us, hey, it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your sensitive data is? And just this challenge of knowing where that sensitive content is in your organization, given that unstructured nature, given that explosion that John talked about, can be a really difficult task just to start with. So this dashboard kind of brings together your sensitive content, shows you where it's located, and helps you start to wrangle with that. Of course, we want to prevent data loss and accidental sharing or oversharing of your sensitive data, and then apply protection actions to that content as well. But ultimately, we're here to talk about governing your data and retaining your data to the right schedule, deleting data on a schedule, and storing that data in a compliant and records management compliant way. And so we're going to drill into that specific piece a little bit more closely. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to emphasize that within information governance, we really have two solutions. And so today we're going to talk mostly about records management. It's kind of the new kid on the block, recently became GA over the last couple of months. And we're really excited by some of the adoption that we're seeing with this solution, but did want to highlight information governance as a key related solution that oftentimes comes up in the similar conversations. So if we go to the next slide, we just have kind of a quick visual to illustrate a little bit about how we think of these things being connected, but also distinct. And so for information governance, we really think about this as the way to manage risk and liability broadly, and really only keeping what you need and deleting what you don't as you look across your digital estate. And I've heard some people explain this like, hey, we've got a principle that when we have, you know, as a family member and a homeowner, we're getting new stuff, you know, on a regular basis. But as new stuff comes in, hey, we got to get rid of the old stuff and send stuff to Value Village or move it on down the line. So in some ways, we're thinking about, hey, you got to be able to prune that content so you're not just building that corpus of content and filling up that garage. You got to be able to get rid of stuff on a regular schedule to really be able to kind of maintain your productivity and manage your risk. And so information governance is all about kind of what are those broad policies that you're going to put in place to kind of keep that digital estate at a manageable level. And then when you think about content that's, you know, exceeded its useful life, how am I going to get rid of that content over time? You know, there's as we think about kind of content and the lifespan and the useful value of that content, you know, it's going to, over time, the value of that content goes down like this, but the risk associated with that content is going to continue to rise. So organizations want to prune and get rid of content that's no longer relevant. You know, we call it rot, kind of redundant, obsolete, or trivial, at the same time while maintaining and preserving the content that's critical to the organization. And that's a little bit of where records management fits in, where we think about, hey, you've got high value content that requires specialized workflows, kind of the crown jewels of your business in a way that require specific parameters and policies to manage that within. So records management is the solution that's provided to help you kind of manage those specific records and crown jewels of your data estate in that compliant and specific manner. So a little bit about how those two pieces play together. Let me go to the next slide and just highlight, actually reinforces a lot of what John kind of said in terms of the inflection points and the sentiment that he's seen in the market with some of the research, but a little bit about what we've heard from customers and their challenges in this space. And so quickly, you know, one is, hey, records are everywhere. So this data explosion concept and how am I managing and keeping my records? What's the cost and complexity of managing those records now that we're in this new way of working and so many companies are coming to the cloud to work and receive the benefits of productivity and collaboration. And then we also hear about, hey, you know, my end users are great. It's a really smart group of employees, but we just don't trust them to correctly label and get everything organized in the right way all the time. So we want to make sure that there's ways and safeguards that we can put in place to use the system and use some of the automation that we have to support those end users and making sure that, hey, we don't have records that are mislabeled or put in the wrong location or not labeled at all. And then, of course, you know, we don't want to lose any records in the shuffle. So if we're moving content into a separate system, what's the overhead on the end users to do that? Is there a simpler way to support productivity and collaboration whilst maintaining the compliance of your records? And then, of course, the last piece, and this kind of goes across the board in the compliance space, is that, hey, the regulatory updates, the changing landscape of requirements is just staggering. This is a lot of work to keep up with. I think there's some stats around, you know, over 700 updates on a regular basis from over 250 regulatory bodies. So it's just a shifting dynamic that requires a lot of engagement to stay up with. And so that's one of the areas that we've also worked on. Hey, let's make sure that we make this moving target something that we're partnering on with our customers. So there's a little bit about the challenge set that we started with when we went in to start to build out this records management capability specifically. So if we go to the next slide, just to kind of introduce records management as a solution set, you know, this is really about managing your legal, business, and regulatory records and your obligations right within Microsoft 365 platform. So of course, you know, SharePoint is a fantastic document repository and collaboration platform. And of course, we've got Exchange where email and lots of business communications are taking place. So what we found is we're able to kind of do these record management activities right in place within the repositories and the locations that are being utilized for productivity and collaboration. So this is built in, and you can classify, retain, review, dispose, and manage this content right within the system. It's also intelligent and something that we're continuing to invest in to reduce that end user burden so that we can help you do automated and intelligent classification of content in a number of different ways. And we'll take a little bit of a deep dive into that classification approach next so that we can just kind of make sure we're clear on how we're approaching that. And then finally, that it's defensible, so that we're providing you proof of disposal, documented audit trails, all the components that you need to be able to take to your regulators and say, hey, I am retaining this information for the proper amount of time, and I have the right audit trails and protections set up around that content. So this is really the records management solution that we just released to general availability over the last few months, and is now starting to get some good attention from both customers and some from some of our partners as well. So if we go in, I want to spend just a few minutes on the classification, because really when we think about information governance and records management and protection, classification is the key of how we're going to go ahead and start making the right policy decisions for this content. And so, of course, we have a manual process where you can create a label with a policy and publish that label out to your users, and then that's available to be applied to a piece of content within those work surfaces. And that's kind of the standard, the tried and true. That's the way many organizations, that's kind of the backstop, is that manual application of the label to that piece of content by the user. But again, what we've seen is that the automation is really a key requirement, and a lot of organizations are looking to reduce that end user burden over time. So when we look at the automated ways that we can classify, we have a few different things that I just want to talk through quickly. We have location-based applications, so you can define a specific container and apply a label to that container. We also have metadata and property-based application of that classification. So you can use something like a content type to apply. So anything that has a content type of equaling X, then I want to put this particular label onto that particular item. We also have keyword-based classification, so you can say, hey, anything related to Project Foo should have this particular label or this particular policy associated to that. And then we get into things like our out-of-the-box sensitive information types. So we have about over 100 now sensitive information types that span financial data, healthcare data, privacy-related data, and you can create your own custom sensitive information type. We see a lot of organizations using this for if they have a lexicon or a dictionary of terms that they want to build into a specific sensitive information type. You can bring that in, define that information type, or edit the existing ones. And then the new kind of exciting way, the new kid on the block for doing this classification is what we're thinking of as these trainable classifiers. And these are where we're using a machine learned model to understand the context and the meaning around that content, not just the words that are included there, but kind of what is the sentiment. And this is really about custom types of information that are very specific to an organization that are kind of difficult to detect. There's not an exact standard on the way this information has been stored or documented. And so now I want to understand kind of all the items that are related to a particular project installation or a particular contract type within my organization. So I can define that model, train that model with a set of test content, and then run that against a broader set of content and go ahead and tell it yes, no, in terms of, hey, your accuracy is right or not, get it to an acceptable level, and then use that to deploy a classification. So in addition to giving you the option to train your own classifiers, we're also providing a set of out-of-the-box classifiers around common scenarios like resumes, contracts, job descriptions. And so we're seeing some good uptake with that. So once you've done that labeling, you're classified, and then you have the option to put your policies against those labels. And so that's where we say, hey, you could have a policy of, we're going to keep this forever, never delete this piece of content. Or this is sensitive content that I know is important, but I want it to go away after its relevant time. So this is going to be a 2-year retain and delete policy, 5-year retain and delete, 7-year retain and delete. And then you have the checkpoint of, is this a record or not? And I can denote of that label policy, hey, do I want this to be a record? And then that creates specific requirements around that piece of content. And so this is just a little bit about how we approach classification, policy, and then implementing that governance and the requirements around those pieces. So I just wanted to kind of walk through that and make sure that we're on the same page around the different ways that we're bringing automation into this. So I think we can go to the next slide. I wanted to quickly cover on a few of the core features of records management, just to make sure that we're all on the same page of what it is that we're delivering, how it works, and why. So I'm going to step through, I think, about 4 feature areas relatively quickly, and then we'll get into a little bit of the roadmap before we go to Vivek for some of the implementation guidance and what he's seen with some of his customers. So first off is the file plan manager. So what we heard from customers was, hey, it looks like you guys are moving in the right direction. You've got some great capabilities with the labeling and the ability to do record labels, but I've got this retention schedule that's, you know, hundreds of lines long that's offline. How can I merge that or bring that into Office 365? And so what we did was create the file plan manager, and you can actually upload using a templated format into Office 365. It will create your label schema. We have a set of different levels of the descriptors that can be hierarchical. You can customize, so you can include things like reference ID, function, category, subcategory. You can export the file plan if you need to have it offline for review by another team. But this really makes it so that you can start to manage a complex retention schedule kind of quickly and easily and onboard into Microsoft 365 records management in a more seamless way. And so this was a key kind of addition that we brought into this records management over the last year or so. So let's go to the next slide. Of course, disposition review is incredibly important to the records management process. And so we have a disposition review experience, and the way that this works is that as you're setting the policy to go into a label, you identify, hey, do I need a disposition review for this label policy? And if you do, you kind of select that, and then you identify who are going to be the reviewers of that policy. And when that period comes up and it's ready to be disposed of, then that person will get a notification and they can navigate over to the disposition review and see all of their pending dispositions. So we've got some filters that they can utilize for, hey, am I looking at documents or email? I can search within that. I can do some date ranges, multi-select items, and then take that action to either dispose, extend, or change the label of that piece of content. Now, we've heard a lot of feedback, and we have some exciting plans that we'll touch on a little bit in the roadmap about how we're going to improve this over time. But just having this great disposition review experience where you can export and look at kind of all the items that are up for disposition has been a big step forward in helping customers meet their requirements here. So let's go to the next slide. Wanted to touch a little bit on kind of the act of declaring a record. You know, this is such a critical thing, and really for a lot of organizations, this is kind of that tipping point into, okay, now we're managing records. And so how are we enabling end users to have an active role in that, even while we're starting to lean more on the system and automation to do some of that intelligent classification. But you can see here in the screenshot, hey, I'm in my document library, I've got my contract up, and I'm ready for this. This is kind of finalized. It's ready to be declared a record. And so if I open my info pane on the kind of the right-hand side, I can see that I have my various labels that have been published, and I can see, you know, which of the items is going to be most relevant, and actually select that, and that will be applied to that item, and that will then be declared as a record. And so I just want to kind of show that user experience of how this works. I think Vivek will talk a little bit about kind of the strategy around, hey, should these be in all the workspaces? Should they be in one workspace? How to manage that? That's really comes down to organization decision. But the end user action is really quite simple of putting that label onto that document. And then finally, on the next slide, I wanted to cover on a feature that has been kind of a really cool one of bringing together productivity and compliance into the same conversation and equation for an end user. And this is around records versioning. So if you look closely kind of down in the lower right of the slide, you can see this record status, and there's a little toggle there and it says locked or unlocked. And really what we heard from some of our great leading customers who are kind of pushing the envelope on adopting Microsoft 365 for records was, we want to have ongoing productivity and collaboration with a document that has been labeled as a record. Hey, we might need to iterate, we might need to edit, we might need to create a new record from that record. And how can we kind of bring those two things together? So we implemented this feature around record versioning that really enables end users to do that. So if you have a record that's been labeled as a record, instead of that being kind of a locked black box now, the end user has the opportunity to go in there, unlock that record, continue to collaborate or iterate, and then relock that record once it's back to its steady state. And what we're doing on the back end is we're capturing a version of each of those records at that instance. So within the preservation hold library, as I unlock that, I have a version of that record as it was unlocked. So we're maintaining compliance in that process while giving end users kind of options for continued collaboration and kind of productivity in that workflow. So this has been something that's been exciting to see customers respond to and start to adopt in their records management process. So that was kind of a quick walkthrough of, I have one more around the Know Your Data dashboard, and this is related, but kind of a quick walkthrough of the feature set. And here I wanted to just kind of circle back on this because I think it's so important as we think about information management all up, and records management being a component of that, a really important component. But as we think about, again, that challenge of where is my sensitive data? As this unstructured data volume continues to grow over time, what we've brought together with this, and this recently GA'd as well, I believe it was mid-April, so just a couple of months ago, is giving you a proactive view of where your sensitive content is. So I can quickly see, hey, the highest used sensitive content types in my organization. I can understand the locations they're in, and then I can start to put some policies and process around that, whether it's a matter of applying record labels or applying protection or taking some actions to say, hey, I don't want all this PII in these people's OneDrives. Like, that's not the place to store PII. You need to make some changes, and I can reach out and let folks know that they should change their process. So this Know Your Data dashboard kind of brings together that view, enabling you to then take steps on kind of that data estate. Okay, so that was the quick feature walkthrough. I want to round out with a quick view on kind of what we're hearing in terms of the value props, how these things are resonating, and then we'll look at the roadmap and what we're up to next. So, really when we think about built-in records management, many organizations that we hear from are thinking, hey, I've got a system that I'm using now, I've got my users trained on this, how can I think about the benefits, and is it worth making the switch and kind of coming into maybe a modern approach to records management? And what we hear is that, hey, what we want to do is support productivity. And kind of the value props around doing this with the built-in, intelligent, defensible process that we've developed is, hey, I want to do this in line with productivity. So I don't want to have users having to go to multiple systems and managing and context switching. We know that could be a big drain on overall effectiveness. Also, I want to reduce costs. This is definitely a driver as we think about some of our customer organizations, what they're attempting to accomplish, especially now as we work through the pandemic and think about what's next. There's definitely a cost driver. We want to reduce risk. So I want to minimize the operational and legal risk that I have or that I'm creating for my organization. And part of this is I want to have less copies of my sensitive data. So if I'm copying and pushing sensitive data out to additional systems, each time I'm doing that, not only am I creating a need to maintain and secure that content in that other location, I'm also driving that sensitive content to that location and keeping it in its source location. Related, protect data effectively. We want to be able to, rely on the protections that we have in the Microsoft Cloud to do that protection for my core data in one place, and then ultimately achieve better compliance. And back to the suite of capabilities that we've been working to deliver, we think about the ability to do insider risk management. We think about communication compliance, e-discovery, and the other related workflows that are really important as we think about this sensitive data for your organization, kind of all being part of the suite that we're delivering in Microsoft 365. Okay, so let me kind of round out with the last slide that I have on what we've delivered and then what we plan to do next. And so quickly just have a kind of a breakdown on what's currently available, what we've shipped over the last few months, and then our roadmap priorities for what we're going to be up to over the coming time period. And so currently available, we talked through a number of these, of course, the record label, file plan manager, disposition review, automatic or manual declaration of records, the record versioning, the proof of disposal and the audit log, and now the data classification dashboards. And then on the information governance side, one thing that we didn't really touch on is this new set of native connectors where we have a way for customers to bring in non-Microsoft content into the Microsoft cloud through a native connector system. And so for now, we've got kind of a small set, but we're working rapidly to expand that to a much broader set over the coming months. And so today, you can go take advantage of the LinkedIn connector, instant Bloomberg chat, really important for financial organizations who are using Bloomberg chat in their trading floors. I need to be able to monitor that. Facebook, Twitter, and then we're working on the next set of them that will be coming over time. So Ice Chat is there. There's a few other important top ones that we hear from our customers. And we expect over the next 6 months, 12 months, we're going to build this out to be a pretty nice library of several dozen connectors. So this really helps you start to archive and manage your data within Microsoft 365. And then, of course, policies and labels for SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, groups, and teams are a big part of information governance that's available now. Looking ahead and what we plan to do next, really it's around continuing to invest in records management and helping some of our most highly regulated customers accomplish their goals. So a regulatory record label is coming out that really helps achieve immutability at the item level, and this will help strengthen our position on immutable storage across Exchange and SharePoint, and this is coming out over the next few months. Multi-stage and reviewer-tailored disposition reviews. So I talked about, we've been hearing great feedback on the disposition experience we have now, and customers want more. So we're going to continue to build there. And then guided onboarding and helping customers get started quickly. And then for information governance, we're improving performance and reliability for core policies and jobs. More investment in the connectors, as I mentioned, and then we're expanding retention for Yammer and Teams recordings, which we know are top of mind. So I'll go ahead and pause there and then pass over to Vivek and let him take us a little through on kind of getting started with some of these technologies.
Thank you. I think we're going to pause for some questions. John, are there any questions?
Yeah, why don't we have a ton of questions. So I think the way I'd like to do this is just tee up a broad one and a narrow one for you, Nick. Then we'll kind of shift over to Vivek, and then we'll see how many we can get to at the end. And then I promise anything that we can't get to during the course of this, we'll follow up with you directly after the fact. So let me start with the broad one first that came from somebody, which is that Microsoft's been talking about records management in SharePoint through the Record Center for a while now.
Correct.
What's different here?
Yeah, that's great. Really good question. And it's a great point. I'm glad that we brought that up. So I would say some of the key differences are that when we think about the Record Center in SharePoint, it's really just SharePoint focused. And so we're expanding our view of records to be beyond SharePoint. And so when you think about records management in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, you really have the opportunity to manage records at kind of that suite-wide level rather than specifically for SharePoint. The other thing I would say is that we'll continue to invest in the records management solution and the Compliance Center. And SharePoint Record Center is an important capability that we're not going to de-invest in, but it's not something that we're continuing to add value and features to currently. So as we think about the future and where we're going to be going in terms of helping customers and the requirements with records, it will really be in the records management solution over Record Center. And so, we know there's a lot of customers who are using Record Center. They love Record Center. That's not going to go away or become unreliable. It's just that when we think about some of our leading organizations who are kind of taking the further step into the cloud and embracing doing more in the cloud, they're asking for more comprehensive records management beyond what they can do in SharePoint.
And then, like I say, a lot of questions. We'll try to get to more at the end, but this is an interesting one. When you're talking about the little toggle about locking and unlocking records, somebody asked the question, that seems antithetical to the normal records management practice of just, locking something up for good. Can you talk a little bit about who can do that, how they can do that, whether they should be worried about that or not?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and it's an interesting one because we've heard from some customers they absolutely love it, and other customers say, hey, this is going to break what we're up to, and we need more control. And so, yeah, it's a matter of who has the edit access to that particular document can then go in there and lock and unlock it. And what we've made kind of the way that we've approached it is to make sure that we're being compliant in terms of capturing the version records in the preservation hold library, auditing the activities related to that. And then we are working on some more configuration controls for customers who it just doesn't meet their process or the way that they want to manage records. So we'll be continuing to iterate there as well. But it's an interesting one, and Vivek may be able to comment on this as well in his section, because I think he's seen both types of organizations in his work in terms of what side of that capability are they on. Hey, do we like that type of approach that's more open and empowering for end users, or do we want this thing to be really kind of tightly managed and scoped?
Great, thank you, Nick. Vivek, let's turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. John, can you confirm you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so thank you, Nick and John. Very engaging sessions and really a lot to learn. I'm going to cover in the next 15 minutes 3 topics, and I'll try my best. So I'm going to get started with it. So I'm going to first talk about the lessons learned from early adopters and the companies who have already gone through this journey. We heard from John about Teams explosion, and I did receive a lot of requests before the session. So I have put in a slide here about how you can use Teams rollout as an opportunity to embed some of the information governance, record management features, which Nick talked about. And also third, where do you begin? How do you quickly evaluate? If you're on the fence, what's the quickest way for you to evaluate whether this is for you or not? So I'm going to start again with a reset and looking at key challenges, which Nick talked about. And this really is a list of challenges we hear most often from our leaders, consultants, customers who are engaged in records management implementations or have been doing records management for several years now, and now looking to do this in this new form in Microsoft 365. And the key challenge most often begins with managing compliance risks. But underneath that, we find a whole range of related questions. And those are about delivering value out of information, managing corporate knowledge, things about user adoption, and how would you integrate records management controls with existing business processes is really a top of mind challenge for all the adoption programs. And somebody asked a question, what percentage would you say is technology challenge versus business adoption challenge? And in my experience, it's all about business adoption challenge. Technology, in some regards, is the simpler part of it. There are challenges with technology and implementing technology, but it's the integration of that technology, especially in scenarios where customers are looking to manage records together with other forms of information which are not managed as records, and not just in SharePoint Online, but all across Microsoft 365. So my focus in this section would be to draw your attention to key success factors, opportunities, and where you are still on the fence, how do we quickly get you to evaluate Microsoft Records Management? And while we go through the topics in the next 15 minutes, please think about your information governance challenges. Are there any questions relevant to you? Any other top of mind challenges which you would like to discuss as Q&A or follow-up? Please feel free to type in the Q&A section, and we'll try our best to respond to those. Okay, so in terms of the overall process, I want to pick 3 key items here. The first is the strategy. It's important. And the strategy needs to be for all information, not just for SharePoint. And you will find that it is not practical to bring all records into SharePoint either. So your information governance and records management strategy will start from SharePoint, and you will start thinking about SharePoint. But what you've seen is that very quickly organizations are thinking about other areas. How do I manage my emails? How do I manage my videos, which are now stored in Microsoft Stream? If I'm using Teams, how and where different content is stored, different information is stored, and it's too much to bring all of that into SharePoint Online. So really have to think about strategy and your architecture, which is covering all aspects of Microsoft 365. And that's where records management lets you do that, because the aim is to consistently provide you with those toolings in the application, in the system that you're using. And that strategy will, of course, inform your solution design, and through proof of concepts, you will validate not the technology, but the impact of change on existing business processes, end users, and your existing technology landscape. Nick talked about data classification and importance of metadata. I'm going to cover that in the next slide of critical success factors as well. But if you focus on these three things as you start to plan your information governance implementation programs, the outcome of these three activities would be that you would have a more robust, much more informed program plan for mobilization with key agreed scope, and your plan is informed by the validation that you've done already with the business users, not based on a paper exercise. Right, so let's get to the critical success factor number one. And here I'm again going to talk about the information governance strategy. It's essential to kickstart your adoption in the right direction. And a well thought through strategy across your information landscape will also help you manage implementation complexity and impact of change to your end users. So you will hear from me a lot about impact to end users, change management, and business change. And hopefully that will give you the clue that this is all about managing the business change and processes. And for that, you need a clear vision, which is aligned with your business objectives. So in my experience, what we found really useful is that leveraging your own brand vision to connect with your records management or information governance program to a bigger purpose really resonates well with your organization. And it's great for inculcating employee buy-in in telling stories, or when you tell stories that communicate and talk to them and enforce the company's culture, values, and purpose. Define what success factors are important for you to achieve through your program. Is it increased levels of compliance? Is it unlocking business value by curating knowledge? Is it responding to a recent audit finding by regulators? Whatever that may be, you need to be very clear about your success factors, because it's only then you will be able to tie into what you're delivering, your acceptance criteria. Once you're clear with your success factors, have clear requirements. I've seen this is where most projects spend too much time in writing down requirements in Excel spreadsheets. We recommend to create use cases instead of requirement documents. Use cases are more business focused. They focus on business processes, business scenarios, rather than isolated singular requirements. And so it's a great way of very quickly understanding the personas and how certain features and requirements will affect certain personas. And as a result, these top three will significantly simplify your solution design, your business case for change, which your users can identify with, and a business adoption plan to the new market standard. Next slide. I'm going to talk about then extending that strategy to how you can modernize your records management. And so in that regard, many enterprises try to use records management principles still from the paper era to manage records in a digital era. But the growing volume, variety, and velocity of electronic records requires a new approach. And we talked about that previously, is that it's not just about managing documents and emails. You will soon find that you are using new methods of communication, new channels of communication, which will also create records, which will also have information that you will have to bring in or manage in place in order to demonstrate compliance within your organization. And so one of the things that we will talk about here is consider review of your existing structures. This is very specific to SharePoint, and I've included that point, is that one of the key challenge or the blocker organizations find is that you already have a significant adoption of SharePoint, and you've already made your decisions in terms of how you've architected your SharePoint. And deploying records management and integrating records management should not cause you a significant restructuring of your site structures. So we really need to look at very, very carefully how records management will integrate with your existing structures. We also see that companies who have managed records in other systems, they have very granular retention periods. So one of my customers had about 8,000 different retention periods for information. Now, while the technology will obviously support you to create those many retention periods, but from a business point of view, it's not sustainable to deploy 8,000 retention periods and expect your users to manage all of them and select the right information. So we say consider big buckets for retention, reduce your retention periods. but ensure your corporate requirements cover your local requirements. So where you absolutely have the need to have country exceptions, the technology will support that, but plan that carefully. Also plan carefully on manual disposition. I mean, there's a great feature available. Nick talked about it, and the more development coming, but we often find that manual disposition has its place, but don't do that for all records. Think about it. Where possible, automate disposition. But obviously you need to consider what's right for you, and where, based on certain regulation, you absolutely must go for manual disposition. The same goes for event-based retention. It has its similar set of challenges. It's easy to apply event-based retention. The technology supports it now. There's a lot of API-based integration, but somebody needs to do something after the fact. And some of these event periods are rather long, 10, 15, 20 years. So you really need to think about, are you going to be able to embed the event-based retention process in your existing business processes so that it's not dependent on people, it's well integrated with your workflows. And then finally, automation, as much as possible, where it meets your business requirements, your legal requirements, and it doesn't intervene or interrupt your business processes. Right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Just a very quick case study. One of our customers in a highly regulated industry, about 40,000 users. For them, Office 365 had become the new platform for collaboration, but they had question marks about whether records management is for them or should they deploy a third-party product. And so we worked with them to do several proof of concepts to identify the right solution. This included third-party products. But for this particular customer, the clear winner was Microsoft Information Governance and Records Management capabilities, really because it provided that automated capability to out-of-the-box configure your retention policy, your record management policies to integrate with your SharePoint site collections or your Exchange Online mailboxes. And some of the key features that we implemented is really, again, enforcing that message about metadata model, use site provisioning, leverage search to identify information which is a record, which is not a record. And it's a great deal of solutions that we can implement, configure, and you can configure yourself using out-of-the-box functionality. We also had to retrofit existing Microsoft 365 collections, and that quite often in these adoption journeys is the difficult part, is what do you do about your legacy estate? How do you either migrate that, and as you migrate them, find meaningful information? And a couple of outcomes achieved from that session was, or from that engagement, was that we were able to demonstrate to the regulators the increased level of compliance using records management, improvement in search with filters, default metadata, so that from a user point of view, they work with the information, they select the metadata, they work with their workflows, and based on the properties, status, and signals, the system then picks up, and Microsoft Information Governance does the job behind the scenes. Okay, I'm just going to run through the last two slides because I want to keep some time for questions and answers. So lessons learned very quickly. We've talked about strategy and use cases. I just want to highlight here the importance of business collaboration and a sense of co-creation as a key lessons learned from our engagement. And without this being a business-led program, it wouldn't be successful. It's not a technology-led program. It's not a technology implementation. Yes, technology is part of it, of course, but it really is about bringing change in business behavior. So focus on that first, get your basics right, work on your core use cases that you must implement in order to have records management accepted and embedded within your business, and then look at your further improvement. So things on do this later would be, you wouldn't start with machine learning from day one. You will go through that journey. You will look at manual labeling. You then look at auto labeling, but then machine learning is for future and for very specific scenarios. You are not going to migrate. Focus on new information that you're creating, how you can embed those new behaviors very quickly to the new information that's created, and then figure out what you want to do with the legacy information. All right, so I'm going to rattle through next two slides. Teams, I think this deserves a separate session on its own, but very quickly, you can actually look at teams and the Teams rollout as an opportunity. But 3 things I would like you to take away from this is when you are rolling out Teams, do consider these 3 components. First, the architecture. How are you going to create teams and enable your users to create teams, and what metadata or data classification you're going to enforce on teams created either SharePoint site collections or Office 365 groups. Are you thinking about connecting teams through different hubs so that it provides a business context? It's very easy to create teams, but if you're not managing the business context, the business topology, and the default metadata, it would be very hard for you to then determine which team belongs to which part of the business or which line of the business. Really look at the permissioning and sharing model. It can be challenging with teams, specifically instances where most organizations tightly control administrative access in SharePoint sites. Team challenges that model and does need careful planning, not only to demonstrate controlled access management, but also impact on information and records management compliance type of activities. So this is where technology is still maturing, I would say, and you might want to consider additional processes, script-based controls to manage the appropriate use of Teams and its content throughout its life cycle. Don't slow down your Teams rollout, but some of these architectural design principles that you can embed right now to make sure that you are setting up Teams for success later on. The next, consider compliance. Consider deploying retention policies, records management capabilities is available in Teams, and you can label your files within your Teams, etc. Think about protecting sensitive information. From a lifecycle point of view, develop an attestation process. We found that from our customers, creating a Teams is the easy part, but 5 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 year down the line, those teams could be abandoned, and you need to set up a process behind the scenes so that you can automatically understand whether this team is in use, can somebody attest, or the team owner, and then automate that process behind the scenes, but not impacting how users access teams and how users are creating teams. Think about automating decommissioning of inactive teams, and through that also embed management of long-term archival of records which are created within the teams, i.e. labeled, or information which is not labeled but should be a record. All right, and then the final slide, quickly evaluate Microsoft 365 for records management. And this is where Infotechtion can help you through a 4-week proof of concept. What we've done actually is try to identify the quickest route for customers to evaluate the functionality. Customers who are looking to test the functionality and the impact of that functionality on the business. So we fast track the full deployment and automation of creating of test data, test accounts, spin up a test tenant with all the features. And we spend most of the time of that 4-week with you in understanding, bringing your users in and letting them test the system to understand the impact of that. And so in doing that, we've collected a ton of our experience and accelerators to provide you the value and fast track your journey. And I'm also quite pleased to share that very recently we are able to, spin up a POC very, very quickly. Yeah, we are able to spin up a tenant in a matter of days, deploy all the features, and then leave it with you to trial it. And that kind of enables you to understand the system and then engage your IT and compliance team and prepare them for the enterprise implementation. All right, so that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of all the things that I wanted to say. So I'm going to hand back to you, John, see if there are any questions.
Oh, yes, we have a lot of questions. So we had promised an hour. Are you guys okay to go, say, 5 or 10 minutes after the hour?
Nick? Be fine to stay on.
Yeah, 5 minutes should work.
5 minutes, let's do this. Let's do this like a lightning round kind of thing. Rather than, and so let's see if we can get like as many questions in as possible with as answers as pointed as possible. If you want to answer it, just give me a hand sign. And so both of you can chip in if you want, but this will allow us to just kind of motor through some questions. Okay, first one. One of the benefits of the cloud is rapid changes in the technology base. We're struggling with keeping up with all the changes in M365 and functionality. We know there's a roadmap, but it's got a gazillion items on it. How can I keep up to date on the information governance features specifically?
Great question. Yeah, it's a challenge we hear from a lot of customers, but I would say tech community blog. If you're not a member of the security, compliance, privacy tech community, that's the place where we share updates and there's some discussion around these capabilities.
What happens if there's a change in retention periods downstream? Do the historical records change?
There's a
no, not out of the box by changing it, but we've implemented processes through which you can actually adjust the retention periods on the records which have been declared.
We have over 400 record labels in our file plan. How do we reduce the number of labels to make it more manageable?
I think that deserves a review. You're not doing bad. So we've seen people going down from 8,000 to 200. So you're doing very well.
So they should declare victory.
I'm sure there is room for improvement, but well done on actually keeping them to 400.
Okay, what happens with information that's classified as never delete? How's somebody going to find it 20 years from now if it's not centralized in some repository?
So Microsoft has, that's the great thing about Microsoft 365, because it's not just about deploying records management features across, but the search is also centralized. So it doesn't matter whether you're storing the records in a separate corporate archive or within your own collaboration area, you are still able to discover and search that information across all platforms.
This might be for you, Nick. Do you have any plans on developing connectors to established document management apps like Documentum, established ECM players?
No firm plans yet, but it is something we hear, so we're kind of evaluating on our backlog.
How about, what do you think best practices should be in terms of opening up use of Teams? Any suggestions there?
So I covered
for all, I think, is what they're talking about.
Yes, yeah. We covered a little bit of that in my session, but there are a lot of other best practices that we can share. Most common is what we hear from customers is who should be able to create a team and how do we control it in a way that we don't want to disrupt users from creating and quickly creating a Teams instance, but we still want to be able to apply some level of control so that once the team is created, we can know and understand what is it used for, and which business or line of business it belongs to, and what kind of life cycle to be attached to that team.
All righty, let's see. There was a question earlier, I think, Nick, you mentioned that you can't rely on end users to classify content. How do you use labels to get around that?
Yeah, so what we'd heard from customers is they don't feel high confidence on their end users appropriately classifying. So we see a lot of customers using the automated methods of classification, whether it's keyword, content type, sensitive information type, or putting the label on an entire location and then instructing end users to put the right document into that location, whether it's a site or library, as a way to kind of mitigate some of that end user variance.
Okay, 2-minute warning, as they say in American football here. So just a second, let me stroll through some of these. How about any comments on managing transcriptions in Teams? Is that possible? Is that doable?
I'd have to learn a little bit more about the scenario. Managing transcriptions.
I take it they mean meeting,
Oh, yeah. Okay, got it. This is a part of our roadmap item around Teams recordings and transcriptions. Correct. Yeah, so we're working on that. Expect some updates over the next 6 months or so.
Okay, then maybe one last question, and then I'm going to ask each of you guys for one takeaway before we leave here. You were, let's see, when we were talking about disposition reviews, do you enter email addresses of reviewers? And I think they're concerned, given turnover, is that just going to disappear into some email box that's no longer there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we recommend putting multiple reviewers to make sure that you don't, especially with these long retention periods. And then we will bring in the ability to identify a group distribution list that you can maintain and make sure that there's active members within.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I know if I got in my old life at AIM, if I got a disposition review in 2040, odds are I'm not going to be responding to that.
No.
Assuming that I'm still around. All right, let's see. One last takeaway. I think this is one thing I just wanted to say before we close this out is that I think we see this as the first in a series of meetings. So if this has been interesting to you guys, then make sure that you keep an eye.
Proactive partners and feedback to help build our capability and deliver what customers need. So we'd love to see you come along with us on that journey.
And Vivek, takeaway?
I would build on that, and I would say you're in a great company with Microsoft taking the leap into technology and improving the technology. My takeaway for you would be think about business adoption, because the technology is going to get simpler and simpler and you get more tools, but embedding that technology into your business is going to be a key challenge.
That's terrific. So my last takeaway is that pivoting on both their points is that as the technology gets easier and easier, the business strategy becomes more and more important. And I think that's really where Infotechtion can be of great assistance moving forward. Don't forget to check out the handouts associated with this. There's a little tab there before you leave. Make sure you download those. Watch for the future ones. And on behalf of Infotechtion, Vivek and Nick wanted to thank you guys and thank the audience a lot for being here. It was a terrific hour. Appreciate it. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.